The crows scattered first, a dozen black shapes exploding from the olive trees below before Bremer heard the engine. Through his binoculars, the valley resolved into impossible geometry. A column of civilians, maybe 200, moving north along the dust road. Women carrying bundles, old men pushing handcarts, children clutching their mothers' skirts. Standard refugee traffic, legitimate targets carrying supplies to the Americans, 5 kilometers of exposed road through perfect killing ground. His artillery officer already had the coordinates plotted. Then the sound arrived. Not overhead, not distant, alongside. Bremer adjusted focus, and his breath caught. The P-47 Thunderbolt came in from the east, throttled back so far its propeller looked like it was counting individual rotations. The fighter, 7 tons of Republic aviation engineering designed to hunt at 400 miles per hour, was flying at walking speed. 90 miles per hour, maybe less. The engine note was wrong, strangled, like a tiger trying to purr. It passed over the column at a treetop height. The refugees didn't even duck. "Herr Hauptmann!" His artillery officer's voice carried the tight eagerness of a hunting dog on point. "Permission to—" "Wait!" The Thunderbolt banked. Not a combat turn, a gentle, sweeping arc that brought it back down the column's length. The wingtip nearly kissed the dirt road. Bremer could see the pilot's head turning, methodical, scanning, protective. The fighter straightened, climbed 50 meters, throttled back again to that impossible crawl, made another pass. His gunner had appeared at his elbow. "It's escorting them?" Bremer said nothing. Through the glasses he counted the refugees again, watched them maintain their steady pace. The grandmother near the front didn't even glance up when 2 tons of radial engine thundered overhead. The children pointed but didn't run. They'd learned this sound. This particular roar meant safety. "Single round from the 88, his artillery officer said quietly. "That range, that speed, gear down, flaps extended, it's a gift, Herr Hauptmann." Bremer tracked the P-47 through another banking turn and saw what his officer couldn't see from ground level. Every time the fighter banked away, exposing its belly, the ammunition belts in those 8 50 caliber guns caught the morning light. Fully loaded, 400 rounds per gun, 3,200 rounds total. The pilot wasn't just escorting, he was inviting. At this range, that low reaction time measured in heartbeats. The first 88mm shell would still be traveling toward the sky when those 8 guns turned his hilltop command post into a slaughterhouse. The Americans would lose 1 fighter moving at stalling speed. Bremer would lose 37 men and every gun on this ridge before the second shell loaded. "9," Bremer said. The column kept moving. 4 kilometers, 3. The P-47 made another pass, so low Bremer could read the invasion stripes on its wings. The pilot rocked the aircraft gently. Left, right, left, and Bremer realized with a start that it was a signal. The refugees adjusted their spacing, tightened up. They were communicating. His artillery officer lowered his binoculars. They've done this before. Of course they had. The refugees moved with the practiced rhythm of a drill. The pilot flew his pattern with the casual precision of routine. This wasn't improvisation. This was procedure. How many fighters did the Americans have that they could assign them to shepherd duty? How much fuel? Bremer's last Luftwaffe briefing had estimated total P-47 production at maybe 5,000 aircraft. Surely they couldn't spare them for the fighter banked again. This time, Bremer caught the tail number, 2-something-7. He'd seen American aircraft before, shot down hulks and smoking wrecks. The tail numbers he'd recorded ran into the 40s and 50s, hundreds between each sighting. If sequential production meant anything, he pushed the thought away. 2 kilometers. The column passed a burned-out farmhouse, the marker for the edge of American artillery range. Soon, they'd be untouchable. The P-47 made another run, slower this time, the engine note dropping to a baritone growl that Bremer felt in his chest. Beside him, his radio operator stood frozen, one hand on his headset. "Herr Hauptmann, I have regiment. They're asking why we haven't fired." Bremer kept his binoculars raised. "Tell them the air threat prevents effective targeting." The operator's hand hesitated on the transmitter. They both knew what that meant. Bremer was claiming a single American fighter represented such overwhelming firepower that it neutralized an entire artillery battery. Regiment would think him a coward, or worse, but it was true. 1 kilometer. The refugees would reach Allied lines in 20 minutes. The P-47 climbed to 100 meters, circled once in a wide, lazy pattern. Waiting, watching, daring. Bremer's gunner spoke what they were all thinking. They're using a fighter aircraft to protect refugees, not ground attack, not combat air patrol, refugees. The last child crossed into American lines at 13:47 hours. Bremer logged it automatically, professional habit outlasting understanding. 4 hours and 12 minutes to move 5 kilometers. The P-47 had flown the entire route at walking speed, a 7-ton guardian angel that shouldn't have been able to stay airborne at that velocity. Then the engine note changed. Not gradually, instantly. The strangled purr became a full-throated roar that echoed off the valley walls. The Thunderbolt's nose pitched up 30 degrees, 40, 50. Vertical climb, full throttle, the sound of 18 cylinders screaming defiance at gravity. In 10 seconds it went from vulnerable shepherd to combat predator, visible one moment, swallowed by clouds the next. Bremer lowered his binoculars. His hands were shaking slightly. He tried to stop them, failed. His artillery officer stared at him, face pale. "Herr Hauptmann." Bremer waited. "They used a fighter aircraft." The officer's voice cracked. "As a shepherd's dog." 4 hours, a frontline combat aircraft, hundreds of gallons of aviation fuel, all to protect 200 civilians carrying vegetables and clothing to the Americans. The tactical value was nil, the strategic purpose incomprehensible. Unless... Bremer looked at his gun crews. 37 men who'd just watched the impossible, who'd seen an enemy use military assets the way a farmer uses a working dog, casually, routinely, without apparent concern for cost. Who'd learned that the Americans had so many fighters, so much fuel, so much everything that they could afford to waste it on kindness. His artillery officer was still staring at the empty sky. "How many do they have?" Bremer had no answer, but he thought about the tail numbers, the production estimates, the careful mathematics that said this shouldn't be possible. He thought about his own fuel allocation, barely enough to move his trucks twice a week. He thought about the Luftwaffe's last supply drop, 6 weeks ago now. Then he thought about 8 50-caliber guns, fully loaded, and a pilot who'd flown for 4 hours at stalling speed, daring them to shoot. The radio operator approached, hesitant. "Regiment is asking for our after-action report, Herr Hauptmann." What could he write? That they'd been psychologically neutralized by an act of calculated generosity? That the Americans were fighting a war his training hadn't prepared him to understand? "Tell them," Bremer said slowly, "that the enemy used air superiority to deny us target acquisition." It was true, just not in any way that would make sense in a briefing room. His artillery officer hadn't moved, still staring at the clouds where the P-47 had disappeared. "Herr Hauptmann, what if they come back tomorrow? Another column, another... Shepherd's Run?" Bremer pulled out his logbook, began recording coordinates and times with mechanical precision. Professional habit. Something to do with hands that wanted to shake. "Then we watch," he said quietly, "and we count, and we try to understand what we're really fighting." But he already knew. The image was burned into his memory with the permanence of trauma. A 7-ton fighter flying at walking speed, guns loaded, fuel burning, protecting refugees through sheer, overwhelming, impossible abundance. You couldn't shoot at that. Not because you'd lose the tactical exchange, because you'd already lost something much more important. The damage diagram looked like a joke. Oberleutnant Friedrich Koch, spread the captured maintenance log across his workbench, holding the corners flat with spent shell casings. The document had come from a P-47 Thunderbolt that went down near Pisa. Pilot killed on impact, but the aircraft intact enough that American recovery crews hadn't gotten to it. First, Koch was a maintenance officer. He'd kept BF-109s flying with spit and prayer for 3 years. He knew what battle damage looked like, knew the tolerances, knew what was survivable and what was fatal. This diagram violated everything he understood. 227 documented strikes. Someone, some meticulous American crew chief, had marked each hole, numbered them, classified them by caliber. Red dots for 7.92mm machine gun rounds. Blue for 20mm cannon. Black X's for the big stuff, the 30mm MAK-108 shells that could take a wing off. The right side of the fuselage looked like lace. 43 holes clustered around the cockpit area. The engine cowling, perforated. 3 cylinders holed through. The oil cooler showed a blue mark. The 20mm strike circled twice, annotated, "Total destruction, replaced." Koch lit a cigarette with shaking hands. When you put 3 rounds into a BF-109's cooling system, the pilot had maybe 4 minutes. The glycol boiled, the temperature spiked, the engine seized. You bailed out or you died. That was physics. That was reality. This American pilot had flown 180 miles. 3 hours in the air with an engine that should have frozen solid. 3 hours with hydraulic lines severed. Koch could see the notations, counted 6 separate hydraulic failures. 3 hours with control surfaces damaged, stabilizer holed, rudder cables frayed. The report noted the pilot was wounded, right shoulder and left leg. Flew himself home bleeding. Koch flipped through the forms, looking for the inevitable conclusion. Aircraft written off, stripped for parts, relegated to training status. That's what happened when you took this kind of damage. Even if it limped home, it was done. Finished. He found the disposition page. His cigarette fell from his lips. Aircraft returned to service 16 hours after landing. Engine number 11 installed. Armament checked. Test flight completed. Released to combat squadron. 16 hours. Not days. Not weeks. 16 hours. Koch read it again. Then again. The cigarette smoldered on the concrete floor. He didn't notice. They hadn't repaired the aircraft. They'd rebuilt it. Pulled the entire engine, all 18 cylinders, all 2,800 horsepower, 2 tons of radio complexity, and swapped it like changing a tire. The oil cooler, hydraulic lines, control cables, perforated cowling, all replaced between sunset and the following noon. His hands found the technical manual he'd been compiling from captured documents. He'd been trying to understand American maintenance procedures, looking for weaknesses, inefficiencies. Now he flipped to the engine section. R2800 Double Wasp, Pratt & Whitney. The manual listed engine serial numbers in the back, a reference guide for mechanics. Koch's finger traced down the columns. Engine number 1, number 2, number 3. He kept going. The list ran for 6 pages. 6 pages of spare engines, each one numbered, catalogued, ready. They had 6 pages of spare engines. His FW-190 squadron hadn't received replacement parts in 6 weeks. Last month, they'd cannibalized 3 aircraft to keep 5 flying. When an engine failed, the plane sat. When you took damage, you patched it with sheet metal and hope. But the Americans, they just pulled a new engine off the shelf. Koch did the mathematics. If battle damage meant a 16-hour turnaround instead of a total loss, then the mission loss rate wasn't about aircraft destroyed. It was about pilots killed. Everything else was temporary, repairable, replaceable. The Germans measured attrition in airframes lost. The Americans measured it in, what? Inconvenience? He walked outside into the October cold, needing air. The depot yard stretched before him, rows of captured American equipment awaiting analysis. A stack of P-47 drop tanks gleamed in the afternoon sun. 3 damaged Thunderbolt engines sat on pallets, pulled from wrecks for study. Even the wrecks had parts worth saving. Coke lit another cigarette, his third in 20 minutes. Overhead, the sound came before the sight, that distinctive 18-cylinder roar, deep and steady. He looked up. 12 P-47s in 3 flights of 4, heading north toward the front. The sun glinted off polished aluminum. The formation was precise, mechanical, confident. By the numbers he'd been documenting, at least 3 of those aircraft would return with battle damage. Maybe 4. Holes in the wings, shredded cowlings, hydraulic leaks, engine trouble. By morning, all of them would fly again. His FW-190 squadron had 11 aircraft on the roster. 4 were operational. 2 were awaiting engines that would never come. 3 were missing landing gear components. 1 had been sitting with a damaged wing root for 5 weeks. The last had good parts, but no fuel. Coke finished his cigarette, grinding it under his heel. That night, he sat in his quarters writing a report that would never reach anyone who mattered. He documented everything: the maintenance log, the 16-hour turnaround, the spare parts availability, the implications. He knew intelligence was collecting this information, trying to build a picture of American industrial capacity. What they couldn't quantify was the psychology. Every damaged BF-109 that didn't return meant 1 less pilot, 1 less aircraft, 1 more gap in the formation that would never be filled. Every mission eroded capability that couldn't be restored. The Luftwaffe was dying by degrees, each loss permanent, each damaged aircraft a long-term liability. But the Americans, they weren't losing aircraft. They were cycling them. Damage was temporary. The pilot flew, got hit, flew home, got a new plane. The same pilot, again and again, building experience while German replacements arrived green and died fast. Coke set down his pen and stared at the wall. Somewhere north of here, those 12 P-47s were striking targets. Some would take damage. Some might take the kind of catastrophic damage that riddled that fuselage with 227 holes. And tomorrow, repaired, rebuilt, they'd come back. Same aircraft, same pilots, endless. Ghosts that refused to die. He thought about the depot yard, about all the captured equipment waiting for analysis. Every piece told the same story. Not crude mass production, but sophisticated abundance. Radios with spare tubes included. First aid kits with morphine. Tool sets with extras. Everything doubled, tripled, backed up. The sound came again near midnight. More radials, more flights heading north under the stars. Coke stood at his window, listening. He'd learned to identify the engine note. Those were Thunderbolts. Always Thunderbolts. Heavy, steady, inexorable. He thought about 16 hours. 16 hours to swap an engine, to patch 200 holes, to send a ghost back into the sky. How do you fight that? How do you calculate attrition against an enemy that doesn't lose? Coke had no answers. Only the sound of engines in the darkness and the certainty that tomorrow they would return. The column appears through morning fog like a chain of ghosts. Feldwebel Anton Richter raises his binoculars, counts them out of habit. 40, maybe 50 refugees, old men, women, children, trudging south along the valley road with carts and bundles. Standard. The kind of movement his patrol sees every 3rd day. Then he hears it. That sound. The 18-cylinder radio comes from the east, low and angry, and Richter's stomach clenches before his mind catches up. P-47. His men scatter into the tree line, pure reflex, because when those Thunderbolts come in low, they come in shooting, and 50 caliber rounds turn stone walls into powder. But the fighter doesn't attack. It passes overhead at maybe 300 meters, gear down, flaps extended like it's preparing to land. Richter watches through the branches as it banks, impossibly tight, wingtip nearly touching the slope, and comes back. The engine note drops to a strangled growl. The massive aircraft is slowing, throttling back until the propeller looks like it's barely turning. The Thunderbolt settles into a racetrack pattern above the refugee column, circling, protecting. Scheiße, someone whispers behind him. Richter's mouth is dry. He's seen plenty of American aircraft, seen them streak past at 400 miles per hour, seen them dive bomb with casual precision, seen them absorb flak that should tear them apart and just keep flying. But he's never seen one do this. The P-47 is flying so slowly it shouldn't be airborne. The pilot is riding the edge of a stall, engine coughing and complaining, keeping pace with people on foot. His radio man crawls up beside him. Feldwebel, should we report this? Report what? That the Americans have pilots insane enough to fly fighters at walking speed? That they're wasting combat aircraft as guardian angels? Richter keys his radio anyway, gives coordinates, describes what he's seeing, says. Response is curt. Observe. Do not engage. Smart order. Because even crippled by that ridiculous speed, the Thunderbolt has 8 guns and full ammunition. Richter can see the belt feeds, see the gun ports. At this range, that low, the pilot could turn his entire patrol into red mist before anyone got a shot off. So they watch. The column moves at perhaps 4 kilometers per hour. The P-47 matches it exactly. When refugees bunch up, the fighter drops lower, engine wash scattering dust, and people spread out automatically. When a cart breaks down, the aircraft circles tighter, closer, until the problem is fixed. Not hurting. Protecting. Richter pulls out his notebook, starts calculating despite himself. Fuel consumption. A P-47 burns approximately 250 liters per hour at cruise. But at this speed, engine laboring, throttle nearly closed. Maybe half that? Call it 125 liters. The column has been moving for, he checks his watch, 90 minutes. That's 180 liters burned. For what? To escort 50 civilians through 5 kilometers of valley? His entire patrol's vehicles haven't received 180 liters in the past 2 weeks. The mathematician in his head keeps working. One P-47 costs maybe 80,000 Reichsmarks to manufacture, though he's guessing at exchange rates. The fuel it's burning is aviation grade, impossibly precious. The pilot alone represents hundreds of hours of training, irreplaceable experience. And the Americans are using all of it, aircraft, fuel, pilot, time, as a shepherd's dog for refugees who might be carrying, what, medical supplies? Some food? Nothing that justifies this expense, except they're doing it anyway. Richter watches through his binoculars as the P-47 makes another pass. The pilot rocks his wings slightly as he passes the column, and, Jesus Christ, several refugees wave back. They know this pilot. This is routine for them, not the first time, not even the second. They've done this before, his radio man says, voice hollow. The people aren't even scared anymore. At 11:30 hours, the column approaches the bend where the valley opens toward Allied lines. The Thunderbolt makes one final pass, so low Richter can see the pilot's helmet, see him looking down at the refugees like a farmer checking his flock. Then the engine note changes. The transformation is violent, sudden. The snarl becomes a roar, becomes a scream as the pilot firewalls the throttle. The P-47 claws for altitude, climbing at an angle that seems impossible, going from treetop height to 3,000 meters in what feels like 30 seconds. The sound shakes loose pine needles. Then silence. The fighter is gone, swallowed by clouds. The refugees continue walking. Within an hour, they'll be safe behind American lines. Richter's patrol emerges from cover. Nobody speaks. They continue their route south, avoiding the valley road, making for the ridgeline where they're supposed to observe supply movements. But Richter can't stop thinking about what he just witnessed. That night, in the bivouac, he does the math again. One escort mission, roughly 200 liters of premium aviation fuel. Multiply that by, what had his radio man said, that the locals weren't even scared. So, call it 10 missions, maybe 20. Between 2,000 and 4,000 liters of aviation-grade gasoline, burned at walking speed, protecting people who aren't soldiers. His platoon's vehicles have been immobilized for lack of 500 liters. Feldwebel, his radio man, is heating something over a tiny fire. Regiment wants to know if we saw evidence of the escorted refugees carrying military supplies. Richter almost laughs. Tell them we observed routine civilian movement, no apparent military value. He pauses. But tell them the Americans are using P-47s for low-speed escort. They'll want to know that. Will they believe it? Good question. Richter wouldn't believe it if he hadn't seen it himself. Fighter aircraft don't fly at walking speed. You don't waste combat resources on humanitarian theater. You don't burn irreplaceable fuel to make refugees feel safe unless you can afford to. That's the thought that keeps him awake, staring at the stars between pine branches. The Americans can afford to be wasteful, more than wasteful, deliberately, strategically extravagant. They're not carefully rationing resources or calculating every liter. They're solving a completely different problem, operating on a scale where burning 200 liters of aviation fuel to protect 50 civilians is routine. Routine. 3 weeks later, Richter's patrol is repositioned to a different valley. The first morning, 0720 hours, he hears that sound again. 18 cylinders, throttled back, impossibly slow. He doesn't bother raising his binoculars. He knows what he'll see. The shepherd is making his rounds. Oberst Hans Dietrich stands in the pre-dawn cold, flanked by 2 guards who haven't bothered to secure his hands. Nobody runs in January. The truck idles nearby, exhaust turning to fog in the Pennsylvania winter. Where? He asks in careful English. The sergeant, Williams, his name tag reads, just grins. You'll see, Colonel. Dietrich has been a prisoner for 6 weeks. Long enough to understand the camp's rhythms, the food schedules, the mail deliveries. Long enough to stop flinching when the guards laugh, but not long enough to understand this. 47 German officers pulled from their barracks at 05:30, told to dress warmly, given no explanation. The truck convoy rolls through the darkness. Dietrich counts vehicles. 12. He does the mathematics automatically. 47 prisoners, 12 trucks, maybe 6 guards per vehicle. The fuel cost alone would keep a German supply column moving for... He stops himself. These thoughts lead nowhere productive. Then he sees the airfield. P-47 Thunderbolts. Dozens of them, parked in formation so precise it looks painted. The low sun catches their silver skin, their massive radial engines, their 8 gun ports per wing. Dietrich has watched these aircraft from the other perspective, diving through flak, shredding his squadron with those 0.50 caliber guns that sound like canvas ripping but tear metal like paper. Now they're just sitting there, waiting. Sergeant Williams opens the truck's tailgate. Gentlemen, you're going to a Christmas concert. Pick a plane. The words make no sense in sequence. Dietrich looks at the other prisoners. Hauptmann Fischer, who flew Bf-110s until there were no more Bf-110s to fly. Major Kessler, who commanded flak batteries until the ammunition ran out. Nobody speaks. They're waiting for the other half of the sentence, the part where this becomes a firing squad or a propaganda photo or some elaborate American joke. Dietrich starts. It's Christmas, Williams says, as if this explains everything. Well, late Christmas. We got a whole orchestra set up at the stadium. Figured you boys might want to hear something that ain't mess hall radio. He gestures toward the nearest P-47. 2-seater trainers. You'll ride in back. Don't touch nothing. They walk him to aircraft number 37. The pilot is already in the front cockpit, flight suit rumpled, leather jacket worn soft. He turns, extends a gloved hand down. Bobby Henderson, Pittsburgh. You speak English, Colonel? Some, yes. Good enough, climb on up. Gets bumpy sometimes, but I'll keep it smooth as I can. Dietrich hauls himself onto the wing, then into the rear cockpit. The space is tight, smelling of oil and metal and something sweet. Chewing gum, maybe. Henderson reaches back, helps him with the harness. Flown much? Henderson asks. BF-109, FW-190, before. No kidding. How many missions? 138. Henderson whistles. "Shit, I'm at 41. You got me beat, Colonel." He says it casually, like comparing baseball scores, like they aren't enemies, like Dietrich's 138 missions didn't involve trying to kill men exactly like Bobby Henderson from Pittsburgh. The engine starts with a cough that becomes a roar. 18 cylinders firing in sequence. 2,000 horsepower turning a 13-foot propeller. Dietrich feels it through his spine, his chest, his teeth. The whole aircraft shakes. Eager. They taxi in formation. 42 Thunderbolts, each carrying one American pilot and one German prisoner. Dietrich watches the wings flex slightly as they roll, watches the tailwheel swivel. He knows this aircraft's reputation. Brutally tough, absurdly heavy, capable of sustaining damage that would obliterate anything the Luftwaffe fielded. But he's never been inside one. "Tower says we're clear," Henderson calls back. "Here we go." The takeoff is violence made routine. The engine's roar doubles, triples. The tail lifts. Then the main gear unsticks from the runway and they're climbing, the ground dropping away like a stone. Henderson banks gently. Dietrich sees the formation around them. Perfect. Spacing. Perfect altitude. Perfect discipline. 42 fighters flying in loose combat spread. Except they're not going to combat. They're going to a concert with prisoners. "That's where we hit your supply depot last week," Henderson says cheerfully, pointing to a crater visible from 3,000 feet. "See? Right off the main road. Beautiful bombing. Felt bad about the trucks, though. Somebody's got to build those." Dietrich says nothing. What can he say? Yes, that was my unit's depot. Yes, we lost 14 men. Yes, we've been rationing since because of your beautiful bombing. The flight takes 35 minutes. Henderson narrates like a tour guide. "Chemical plant down there, no more. Railroad junction, we hit that Tuesday. Oh, that farm? That's where Jimmy Mitchell crash-landed after Flack got his oil line. Farmer's daughter gave him lunch while he waited for rescue. Nice people." The stadium appears ahead, massive and absurd. They land in sequence, each P-47 touching down with the precision of factory work. Henderson taxis to a parking spot, cuts the engine. "Watch your step, climbing down, Colonel. Wings slippery." Inside the stadium, the orchestra is tuning. Real instruments, violins, cellos, brass that catches the winter light. 200 seats face the stage. Dietrich finds himself sitting between a Wehrmacht tank commander and a Luftwaffe navigator, watching American musicians prepare to play German composers. They open with Beethoven. The Fifth Symphony. Dietrich closes his eyes and he's back in Berlin, 1938, before everything. The notes are perfect. They've flown 42 combat aircraft, burned thousands of gallons of fuel, committed hundreds of man-hours to give this to prisoners. Brahms follows. Then Bach. The conductor is U.S. Army, a lieutenant who directs with surprising grace. Between movements, Dietrich does calculations he can't stop himself from doing. Fuel consumed, maybe 12,000 gallons for 42 aircraft. That's 4 days' allocation for a panzer battalion. Man-hours, 84 pilots, 42 ground crews, the orchestra, the guards, the logistics personnel. Combat capability expended. These 42 Thunderbolts represent more striking power than his entire air district possessed in 1943. All of it spent on kindness. Not interrogation, not propaganda, though it is propaganda of the most devastating kind. Not re-education. Just this, music, comfort. A gesture that says, "We can afford to be generous because your defeat is so inevitable. We've already moved past you to rebuilding what comes after." The concert ends with a standing ovation. German prisoners applauding American musicians playing German music in an American stadium after arriving in American fighters that will burn American fuel to fly them back to their American prison camp where they'll eat American food and sleep in American heated barracks. On the flight back, Henderson is chattier. "You think the war's almost over, Colonel?" "Yes," Dietrich says. "We lost when you could afford this." This? Concerts. For prisoners. Using fighters as transport. Burning fuel like like it costs nothing. Henderson is quiet for a moment. The engine fills the silence. Then, it does cost nothing. That's what you guys never got. We make so much that spending it on you doesn't even register. Back home, they're probably building another 10 of these planes today. Tomorrow, 10 more. You can't fight that with ration cards and efficiency. Dietrich watches the sunset through the canopy. Orange and red bleeding across Pennsylvania winter. He thinks about every sacrifice the Reich demanded, every gram of butter saved, every liter of fuel conserved, every efficiency ruthlessly optimized. They built a war machine on scarcity, perfected it, made deprivation into doctrine, and lost to an enemy who used scarcity's opposite as a weapon. They land as darkness falls. Henderson helps him down from the wing. "Thanks for not trying anything stupid, Colonel. I'd have hated to miss that Brahms." Dietrich almost laughs. "Where would I go? An American sky and American plane surrounded by American everything?" He gestures at the airfield, the lights, the endless rows of aircraft. "You won already. This was just showing us the mathematics." "Maybe," Henderson says, "but the music was real too. That matters." On the truck back to camp, Dietrich sits in silence while the other prisoners talk excitedly about the symphony, the flight, the impossible generosity. He understands what they don't yet. This wasn't generosity. This was demonstration. The kindest, most devastating demonstration possible. You can't defeat an enemy who makes war with their surplus. The valley hasn't changed much. Klaus Bremer stands in the same spot where his command post used to be, though the bunker entrance is long overgrown with wild rosemary and thyme. The road below, the one where impossible things happened, is paved now, but it follows the same dusty track those refugees walked in September 1944. He's 73 years old. His hands shake slightly from age, not fear, though the distinction feels academic. Two men climb the hill toward him. Americans. One moves with the careful precision of someone whose knees have logged too many flight hours. The other, younger by a decade, still has the ramrod posture of career military. "Hauptmann Bremer?" The older one extends his hand. "Bobby Henderson. We spoke on the phone." The handshake is firm. Bremer notices the subtle calluses. Throttle hand, stick hand. 40 years haven't erased the marks. "Colonel Henderson," Bremer says. His English is accented but clear. "Thank you for coming, and you must be—" "Captain James Mitchell," the second man says. "57th Fighter Group. Flew Jugs out of Pisa." Jugs, the American nickname for the P-47. Bremer has heard it before, during interrogations, in captured letters. It still sounds absurd. Calling that massive, lethal machine something as homely as a jug. They settle on camp chairs Mitchell brought, sharing a bottle of Chianti from a vineyard 3 kilometers south. The same vineyard that existed in 1944, though under different ownership. Bremer pours with steady hands. "This is where you watched?" Henderson asks, looking down at the valley. "Here? Yes." Bremer gestures to the southern approach. "They came from that direction. Maybe 200 civilians. Old men, women, children, a few carts. September 7th, I think, or 8th. Mitchell leans forward. "Weather? Clear. Hot. Good visibility." The details come easily. Bremer has replayed that day 10,000 times. "We saw them at 0943 hours. My artillery officer wanted to engage immediately." "But you didn't," Henderson says. "No." Bremer sips his wine. "Because at 0947, your fighter arrived." The light is starting to go golden, the same quality it had that afternoon. Bremer points to where the P-47 first appeared, throttled back impossibly slow, massive radial engine coughing and snarling at a speed that should have stalled it out of the sky. "It flew for 4 hours, Bremer says. "Walking speed. I counted. The pilot made 37 passes, sometimes so low I could see his face. Young, American, chewing something. Gum," Mitchell says. "We all chewed gum, helped with the pressure changes." Henderson is studying the valley with professional interest, calculating angles and approaches. "Ballsy. At that speed, that altitude, one good burst." I know. Bremer refills their glasses. My 88 made me could have taken him easily. Should have taken him. Those refugees were carrying supplies. Food, medicine, legitimate military targets. So, why didn't you? Bremer considers the question he's been asking himself for 40 years. I told myself it was tactical, that his guns were loaded, that he would have killed all of us before we could fire twice, but that wasn't the real reason. What was? I couldn't understand it. The words come slowly, carefully. The fuel alone, 4 hours at combat throttle, even reduced power, the wear on the aircraft, the risk to the pilot. And for what? To save civilians? Non-combatants? It made no military sense. Mitchell laughs, not unkindly. Hell, Klaus, that was probably Tommy Watkins. He did that run twice that I know of, maybe 3 times. Drove the engineering boys absolutely crazy. They said he'd burn out the engine running that slow, that rich. But he did it anyway. He did it anyway. Mitchell swirls his wine. Tommy figured, what are they going to do? Court-martial him for protecting refugees? Henderson is watching Bremer carefully. You've been thinking about this for 40 years. 40 years, 2 months, 17 days. Bremer sets down his glass. I need to understand. The Shepherd runs. The POW concert flights, I heard about those later from Oberst Dietrich. The fuel you jettisoned, the aircraft you repaired. Overnight, He struggles for words. The casual abundance of everything. How? In a war, how could you afford such things? The 2 Americans exchange a glance. Some wordless communication passes between them. You want the strategic answer or the real one? Henderson asks. I want the truth. Henderson stands, walks to the edge of the hill. The sun is lower now, painting the valley in amber and shadow. We couldn't afford not to, Klaus. That's the truth. Bremer waits. You guys had us figured wrong from the start, Mitchell says. Your intelligence reports, we captured a bunch of them later, you consistently underestimated our production. Thought we'd built maybe 5,000 P-47s total. We built 15,683. The number lands like a physical blow. But it wasn't just the numbers, Henderson continues. It was the whole equation you were solving. You thought the war was about efficiency, about sacrifice, about who could endure more, ration better, fight harder with less. And you thought, we knew it was about abundance. Henderson turns back to face him, about having so much that we could afford to waste it, to throw away drop tanks before lunch, to rebuild shot-up fighters in 16 hours instead of scrapping them, to burn 47,000 gallons of avgas flying prisoners to a Christmas concert. That's not war, Bremer says quietly. That's madness. No. Mitchell's voice is gentle but firm. That's psychology. Klaus, what broke you wasn't the fighter escorting refugees. It was that she couldn't shoot it down, because you understood. We could afford to lose it, and you couldn't afford to provoke that loss. The abundance itself was the weapon. Bremer feels something shifting in his chest, a pressure he's carried since 1944. The kindness, too, Henderson adds. Flying POWs to concerts, using fighters as shepherd dogs. That wasn't propaganda. It was demonstration. We were showing you that we could afford to be generous, to waste resources on mercy. And that generosity was more demoralizing than any bombing raid. Because we couldn't match it, Bremer says. Because you were solving for scarcity, and we were weaponizing surplus. Henderson sits back down. You calculated every shell, every liter of fuel, every man. We calculated how much abundance we could deploy to break your will to fight. Different equations, different wars. The valley is going purple with dusk. Somewhere down there, 40 years ago, 200 refugees walked to safety behind an impossible guardian. I became a teacher after the war, Bremer says. I tell my students about this valley, about the fighter. Some of them think I'm exaggerating. You're not, Mitchell says. If anything, you're probably underestimating. The stuff we pulled, he shakes his head. I personally jettisoned maybe 8,000 gallons of fuel during my tour, just threw it away to climb faster, to extend range, To get home lighter, 8,000 gallons, your monthly allocation for a panzer battalion. Henderson is watching the last light fade. I flew 23 POW transport missions, Christmas concerts, recreation flights, hospital visits, logged maybe 100 flight hours doing it. 0 escapes, 0 incidents. Just kindness, because we could. Bremer pours the last of the wine, dividing it carefully among 3 glasses. I spent 40 years thinking we lost because we weren't strong enough, he says. Because we lacked resources or courage or will. But that's not it, is it? No, Henderson says. We lost because we never understood what war you were fighting. We thought it was soldiers against soldiers, tanks against tanks, sacrifice against sacrifice. And it was abundance against scarcity, Mitchell finishes. You can't ration your way to victory against an enemy who treats fuel as disposable, aircraft as renewable, and kindness as a tactical weapon. They sit in silence as stars begin to appear. The same stars that lit the valley in September 1944 when a lone fighter flew circles around hope. Thank you, Bremer says finally, for coming, for explaining. Thank you for the wine, Henderson says, and for not shooting. I couldn't have anyway. Bremer stands, joints protesting. That pilot? Watkins, you said? Tommy Watkins, yeah. He knew that I wouldn't fire. He was counting on it. He was counting on you being smart enough to understand the math, Mitchell says, and you were. They walk down the hill together as darkness completes its claim on the valley. Behind them, wild rosemary releases its scent into the cooling air. Somewhere in the distance, a jet passes overhead, a sound Bremer still tracks instinctively, though the war ended 4 decades ago. The abundance equation. All those years, he'd been trying to solve it with German mathematics. Efficiency, sacrifice, scarcity. But the Americans had been working in a different system entirely. One where waste was strength, where surplus was a weapon, where you could afford to be kind because the cost was, to you, nothing at all. He finally understands. And understanding, after 40 years, feels like a kind of peace.